Can we improve visuals on consoles, modern or retro alike, with an external graphics processor? This year sees the release of Marseille's mClassic, an all-new and improved version of the M-Cable we covered 2 years back. Advertised as a kind of external graphics card, the mClassic is, put simply, an HDMI dongle that attaches to the back of any console to administer post-effects, tweaks and scaling. It relies on a micro USB cable to give it power, drawing just 1 watt of power at peak to drive an onboard ASIC processor. From there, it interprets each flat 2D frame as it arrives from the console, adding contextual anti-aliasing, color boosts, intelligent sharpening, and then upscaling the result. It's promised that all of this is achieved with no perceptible input lag, something that holds true in my experience. But at a cost of $100 and with no UK release so far, are the visual upgrades truly worth the expense for modern games, notably for Switch? Let's take a quick look at the unit itself and how it sets up. You get 3 pieces in the box: the mClassic dongle, a USB cable to power it, and an HDMI extender. You'll need to track down a mains adapter for the USB, but any PC, console or TV will provide ample power for it to run. The extender is included as a way to support Switch while docked, since that big M shape on the mClassic casing makes it impossible to slot into the back otherwise. Plugging it into the Switch, Xbox One or even an OSSC is a doddle with all of these pieces in place. The mClassic unit itself has a stylish finish to it too, with a large red grip and a gold painted finish to the rear end, plus of course a new feature on its side, a processing mode toggle we didn't have on the M-Cable. This new toggle is possibly the biggest upgrade for mClassic. We do get algorithm refinements and the ability to upscale 720p 60Hz and 1080p 60Hz content to a maximum of 1440p, where M-Cable just peaked at 1080p. That physical toggle on the side though addresses a major drawback for the M-Cable, that it was simply too much of a plug-and-play device. Supposing the on-screen content wasn't a good fit for the cable's processing, like 2D sprite work, then you had no choice but to disconnect the cable and use a regular one. Here, there's now an integrated option. That switch gives you 3 modes, starting with a pass-through that leaves the signal entirely untouched. Next, the middle notch enables the mClassic processing, with the LED lights up green. And finally, there's a dedicated retro mode on the last notch, turning the LED blue. This is custom tailored for older 480p content, forcing the output to a 4:3 aspect ratio, while again scaling all the way up to 1440p if you have a PC monitor attached. Otherwise, you'll get a 1080p output to most TVs. Alright, so a final quick note on the limits of the mClassic before we get to the benefits. Firstly, it's worth stressing that with processing enabled, you lose HDR functionality on PS4 or Xbox One. It's not factored into the algorithm, but on the plus side, since the audio signal is untouched regardless of mode, you keep features like Dolby Atmos. It passes right through. Another catch is the way 4K content is handled. The mClassic only upscales 720p and 1080p input signals at low refreshes to 4K, such as 24, 25 and 30Hz. These are frame rates usually reserved for movie playback and not games which depend on 60Hz. The official website lays it all out clearly, but essentially anyone looking to upscale their Switch, base PS4 or Xbox One's 1080p output to 4K will have to look elsewhere. In my case, my LG B8 TV and all capture cards simply received a 1080p and 60Hz signal at the end from these consoles, but PC monitors will trigger the mClassic to push out 1440p if it's supported. With that in mind, let's take a look at the mClassic in action, and with a focus on Switch. Fundamentally, it's a shame we can't get this console to upscale to 4K at all. PS4 and Xbox One have 4K equivalent models, but there's no such option for Nintendo yet. Given the rise of Ultra HD TV sets, it would have been useful, but at least the other benefits of the mClassic do show up even at the peak 1080p output. Side by side shows subtle tweaks in colour depth, More saturation is obvious in already colourful games like Smash Bros. Ultimate, as well as the added sharpening on character outlines. There's a crisper presentation all round thanks to that contextual sharpening, though it does take a 2x zoom to really show here. The downside really is common to most sharpening filters, the ringing artifacts. This manifests as a faint white halo effect around high contrast points, though on the whole the effect is quite subtle in motion. What about the reported anti-aliasing then? Well, it must be said this really depends on the resolution of the game at hand. So for example, a native 1920 by 1080 resolution game like Call of Juarez Gunslinger should be a good test case. This launched with no AA and in fact even has a stylized cartoon aesthetic which accentuates the stair-stepping. It should be perfect for edge detection, but as with the M cable before it, 1080p output games don't seem to trigger it aggressively. Looking to the trees just ahead, you can see the anti-aliasing does kick in to an extent with a slight softening of the edges, but there's still visual noise and shimmer on the grass down below. Pokemon Sword and Shield, which again has a dynamic 1080p setup well docked with no anti-aliasing, also has limited gains. The most obvious upgrade we see there is sharpening to those edges, if anything, rather than a smoother appearance. The one case where it does take effect is, surprisingly, the re-release of Virtua Racing on Switch. Again, a 1080p game, but with edges so defined, the mClassic does end up treating a few along the way. In the main, colour enhancements and sharpening are the main advantages, for 1080p playback at least. The extra complication is that dynamic resolution is used widely in games for the system. That includes first-party works like Mario Odyssey, with a range from 900p down to 720p, plus numbers in between. That'll make the image hard to interpret. Others, like Rocket League, with its sub 720p image, can be set to a 720p output from the system to give the mClassic a more straightforward signal with less scaling, but even then there are drops below. The rule of thumb, as with the M cable before it, is that the algorithm prefers lower resolutions, and that's really a challenge because the more practical setting for Switch is 1080p in a bulk of games. It's not an aggressive overhaul, the result all round is a subtle but nicely tuned upgrade on Switch, simply adding more definition and pop to the action, but the anti-aliasing effects are limited. A quick point on 4K consoles like PS4 Pro and Xbox One X. Supposing you have one connected to the mClassic, it's worth stressing it only takes a YUV420 signal from the console, rather than full RGB. It's a compromise to suit the mClassic's bandwidth, but really doesn't make a huge difference on a TV at typical playing range. In this case, you're best switching your Pro or X to the automatic mode to allow it to adjust. The upside is, of course, all scaling to 4K is already handled by the console, but ultimately the benefits mClassic brings in image processing aren't obvious at all. Picking the original 360 version of Mirror's Edge, which gets enhanced by X to push a native 3840 by 2160, gives a very cleanly presented example. You get lots of straight lines and flourishes of colour dotted around the rooftops, and yet even zooming in by 4 times here, there's really no major perceptible upgrade. Likewise for the rebooted Grid, a 1440p game on X with dynamic resolution, the algorithm has a very limited effect all round to 4K output content. The retro mode switch is really where the mClassic shines. Right off the bat, it forces a 4:3 aspect ratio on all content, which is helpful in a majority of cases, though you can revert to the regular processing mode, supposing games have 16:9 support. The key here though is that looking at Power Stone on Dreamcast, the upgrade is far more pronounced. I'm sending it a 480 progressive signal via HDMI, using a Toro VGA box connected to an OSSC, which simply passes that 640x480 resolution through to the mClassic. From there, the colour saturation is boosted vividly compared to a playthrough with processing disabled. Even interlaced 480 and 576 signals are accepted, but clearly the ideal is a progressive 480p picture, and it looks great. Power Stone stands out for just how well its aliasing is treated. Dreamcast titles generally had no anti-aliasing at all. A raw 480p image is all we got, and as such, it makes it an easy console to design an algorithm like this around. The parameters are easy to predict, more so than modern games with varying resolutions, AA methods and complex shader work. In this case, most stair-stepping is treated and the game looks much easier on the eye with the mClassic enabled. There's a softer appearance if we apply a 2x zoom, yes, but texture clarity isn't affected aggressively, and what's there is amplified overall by the sharpening pass. The same applies to Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, another classic ported to Dreamcast by Treyarch. The attract screen footage here runs at a lower 20 FPS or so, but it works in example. The less vibrant colour palette doesn't reveal the anti-aliasing as clearly, but it's certainly kicking in, and the image on the whole is much more nicely presented. Not everyone will like the mClassic's effects. There's perhaps a degree of nostalgia attached to seeing those pixels left raw, but in my experience it adds more than it detracts. PS2 games benefit too, of course, even if progressive scan support was limited to a small portion of games. Shadow of the Colossus is a big one. 480p support is in, and the huge scale of the game made that push for image quality essential at the time. Even using PS2's best output though, it felt like a game constrained by the limits of its era. Sweeping landscapes and tall buildings packed with dense detail could cause lots of pixel crawl, even on CRTs of the day. Routed via the OSSC through components, we can push a 480p feed via HDMI to the mClassic, and the image is cleared up to a large extent. It's not as snug a fit as Dreamcast titles, and that goes likewise for Soul Calibur 2, shown here running on PS2 with progressive scan enabled. The image quality is inherently less clean to start with, but enabling the processing does have a positive impact overall. A final word on retro performance. Marseille advertise even older consoles going back to the 32 and 16-bit eras, including the likes of Sega Saturn, so I figured it'd be worth a try. Now the catch here is that 240p signals popular in that generation aren't accepted by the mClassic, and so we have to again use something like the OSSC or a FrameMeister to convert that signal first. In this case, my OSSC takes a 240p feed via the SCART cable and converts it to 720 by 480 with a 2x line doubler. This is essential for us to see any image at all from consoles like Saturn, Super NES, Mega Drive or beyond. And the results? Well, it's clearly not as well tuned as Dreamcast games, and in some cases it works against the content of the games, which were often 2D in nature. 2D sprite work suffers especially. Taking Outrun as an example, the Sega Ages port on Saturn is given the works, sharpening, intelligent focus, and even anti-aliasing is applied to its 2D pixel art. It creates a smudged, rounded effect to some corners, and at some points the stair-stepping is evened out to a straight line. It's the mClassic doing its job, but it sadly undoes the aesthetic of the game. Those pixels are meant to be shown raw. This is where the pass-through mode on the mClassic comes in handy, but even 3D titles like Panzer Dragoon don't look all that attractive when it's enabled. The image is filled with noise from the scale to 1080p, while segments are treated with AA for a few frames at a time. It doesn't have the consistency Dreamcast games do, and I suspect feeding it an upscale 240p signal doesn't help. It's an interesting experiment then, but given the bulk of titles on Saturn gave 2D the spotlight, it's perhaps not an ideal fit. All round, the mClassic is a respectable step up in ambition from the mCable. The physical mode toggle on the side makes it a more flexible device in general, while 1440p support is a welcome plus too, especially for PC monitor users. It can't be stressed enough though. Dreamcast users, and by extension anyone with a GameCube and an HDMI adapter, will see tangible upgrades using this. Power Stone has never looked so cleanly presented outside of emulation, and it's impressively calibrated for it. The gains are sadly less extreme on Switch, but respectable, while native 4K content shows barely any upgrade at all in my experience. The main downside is the lack of 4K upscaling from 60Hz sources. For 4K TV users, that means an extra upscale operation is needed after receiving a signal from the mClassic, having already done its own upscale from 480p or 720p in older games. For around $100, it's perhaps worth it. Retro gamers will discover a handy tool to have in the box, and so long as you're okay manually switching the processing off for games that aren't suited to it, there's a lot of fun to be had here. In my time with it, lag is also unnoticeable too from the device, much in the same vein as the M cable. Expectations really do have to be managed when it comes to modern games though. At least in the case of Nintendo Switch, the likes of Smash Bros. Ultimate are visually bolder and sharper. Possibly a larger, pricier upscaling unit with more involved settings that can be defined by the user would fill the blanks for a more refined 4K upscaler. mClassic otherwise does what it sets out to do, and in a form factor that stays discreet. It's not all things to all users, but when it works, the results are impressive. But that's all I have for today. If you did find this breakdown of the mClassic useful, please feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell to get notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.